Hi, David O'Brien, Team O'Brien Real Estate, Marin County, California. Just wanted to take a few minutes, probably 10, to talk to you about homeowners associations and then reviewing those documents. This could go a little bit over 12 minutes. I'm going to try to be succinct. You're always welcome to follow up with a call if you have questions. So I don't have a designation. I'm not certified. I'm not a CPA. My experience is just reviewing those when I'm representing buyers or when I'm representing sellers, where that property is, part of a homeowners association. So please just be aware of that. The companies that do this or analyze like the budget and the reserves and the financials, they're typically in Sausalito. There's a few in San Francisco, but I find that predominantly the homeowners associations here in Marin use the companies that are out of Sausalito. So the documents that you're going to be looking at are codes, covenants, and restrictions, CC&Rs. You're going to be looking at rules and regulations. You're going to be looking at bylaws. You're going to be looking at the reserve study, financials, sometimes called the budget, and then you're going to be looking at the minutes. So to just go through those, when I'm looking at the codes, covenants, and restrictions, what I'm looking for as an agent or a broker is I want to see who's responsible for what, and that's where you'll find that information. And be mindful that sometimes they'll have amendments. So if you're going through the codes, covenants, and restrictions, and it says one of 56 pages, there may be 10 or 12 after that. That's an amendment. So make sure you look at those amendments too, because sometimes, of course, they'll change the CC&Rs with those amendments. Please be aware of that. So what I'm looking for is the responsibilities of who's responsible for what. If the homeowner's responsible for this, the HOA is responsible for that. I want to know what's going on with that, and then I can pass that on to my client. Next, I want to see, usually folks want to know, can they have pets? So I'll look for how many pets you can have. Do they have restrictions on the number? Do they have restrictions on the size? And you can find those in the codes, covenants, and restrictions, or CC&Rs. And then lastly, for me, is I'm looking for, are there rental restrictions? And what are those, how to have those spelled out there. Recently, on a side note, the California state legislation has legislated that they're no longer going to allow for there to be rental restrictions on condominium associations, in that it can't be short-term rental for less than 30 days, but they can't put a timeline for how long the unit needs to be owner-occupied, which is very prevalent in Marin County. So this hasn't had a lot of chance to play out to see how they're going to enforce that, because it's only been in effect, nominally speaking, for a short term. So we have to see how that's really going to come into effect later on. So be aware of that as well. So then next, I'll look at the financials and the budget. And so what I'm looking in there for first, I'll go to the first page I'll go to, and it's not always easy to find. I want to know what the percentage is that the HOA is funded. And typically I would say that it's 30 to 50%. That's the normal amount that I see through my day-to-day experience with homeowners association over a number of years, and how they come to that determination of, okay, it's 30 or 40% funded based on what? It's a projection of a 30-year time period, and then the costs associated with the upkeep of that homeowners association, and then the accumulation of money into the reserve over that 30-year period. And then they take that, and then they have an algorithm that CPA will come up with, and they'll say, okay, based on this, you're 30 to 40% or 52% funded. And so I'll look to see what the percentage funded is, because if it's on the lower side, that's going to be a red flag, something that I'm going to point out to my client immediately. The next thing that I'll look at is after that is they'll have the CPA that's doing the analysis of the HOA. There's a box, and it's checked. It basically says something very similar to this, although they do have variations. But it'll say, based on the reserves and the projected accumulation of dues over the next 30 years and the upcoming upkeep of the complex, do you feel that there's sufficient money to accommodate all those repairs without there being a special assessment? And it'll say yes or no. And then it'll say, if it says yes, then it'll offer an explanation. if they say no, then they'll offer an explanation. And then they'll say some things in the paragraph below that. They'll say, well, in order for it to get a yes, then there will need to be a special assessment from every unit for $5,000 or $3,500, or there'll need to be an increase in the monthly dues of $125. Total made up numbers, but that's what I'm looking for. So let's say the budget says that it's 30% funded. Then the next thing that I'm going to look at after those first two is I'm going to look to see, okay, what's the remaining useful life on these items? And these items are the ones that I find in my experience to be the ones that are the most costly and the ones that fail most often in homeowners associations. Siding is one. If it's wood siding or shingle siding, that typically is the biggest problem, or the one that fails the soonest. It's starting to be mitigated a little bit because they're using cement shingles, so those are lasting longer than the previous wood. So just be mindful of that as well. So I'll look at the siding first, and then it'll say useful life and it'll say remaining life in these two columns. And if it says useful life 30 years and then it says remaining life 21, then that's a good sign in my opinion. Then I'll go to the roof next, and that's the same scenario. If it's 20 years, or 30 years useful life and there's 21 years remaining, that's a good thing. And then what I'll look after the roof, the siding, is decks. If there's decks, I want to know about that. And then the next is asphalt in the complex. And sometimes those four can vary a little bit depending on if there's a lot of asphalt. Are there large decks? Then you just want to pay more attention to that based on the percentage of that in regards to those items. So that's what I would look for in financials for a budget. And then really the next thing is the rules. I'll get into the rules too, because sometimes they'll offer more explanation for pets, rentals, use of the clubhouse, things of that nature. And then that's pretty much pretty much it. Oh, in a nutshell, almost, except for the minutes. So the minutes are, I would say, one of the most important things to review. So, and the minutes are the meetings that the HOA has, typically monthly. Sometimes it's quarterly, sometimes it's annually, but more often than not, it's monthly. So the board gets together. It's usually a president, a treasurer, a vice president, the property management company that manages the association, and then homeowners. And they'll have meetings and they'll talk about the running of the day-to-day of the complex, and then they'll talk about reviewing the financials and the budgets and any upcoming projects, and then approval. Joe Smith wants to paint his deck or put on an epoxy on his deck or change his windows or put in AC, and there's not an AC unit now. All those things will be discussed in the minutes. Also, again, special assessments. That's why I would encourage you to go through the minutes. It should be obvious in the reserve study that they have a mark. Do you expect a special assessment? And it goes across years. And if they're expecting one, it's supposed to be marked there. But I find that they're not always as attentive to that as they should be. So it's really important to review the minutes to see if it's been discussed about in the previous 12 months, because that's provided legally. That's what's supposed to be provided, the preceding 12 months of HOA meeting minutes. And then, on top of assessments, just, things of, there's been a disturbance at the pool, or there's been an outbreak of bike thefts in the complex. You'll be able to find all that information. And I don't typically review the minutes myself, because what I've found is that folks are very opinionated on what they can find in there. So I'm always very encouraging of my clients to go through those. And then once they've gone through them, then if they have questions, then I expound on that. And I think that's pretty much the long and the short of Homeowners Association and documents there. I could get into more detail, but I'd like to just ask that you follow up with questions, and I'm happy to answer those. And then I'll finish with this. So in the last 14 months, 3 times I've had a client, 2 times a client purchase, and then they were hit with an increase in their dues that was not shared anywhere in the documents that I looked through. So what I'm doing now to try to mitigate that as much as possible is I'm sending an email to the homeowner, if I'm representing the buyer, through the listing agent, asking for some board member to confirm that there's no projected cost in the dues going up. In the third case, it was where I was representing a seller, and it wasn't even disclosed to the seller or any of the documents that I reviewed. And then there's 2 documents that you'll get. It's an HOA information request. It's 2 pages, I should say. And on there it says, are you expecting a special assessment? No. Are you expecting an increase in dues? No. And in each of these instances, those were both checked no, but it still came to be that there was an increase in the dues on a month-to-month basis for these 3 transactions in the last 14 months. So it's important to try to get an email directly from a board member through the listing agent, just confirming that they're not expecting any increase in dues. I hope you found this helpful. If you need to reach out, 415-342-1968, David O'Brien. All the best.